The garage apartment was a world of its own, connected to the main house by a covered walkway, but separated by a chasm of indifference. My new life had rules, unspoken, but as rigid as the concrete floor beneath my feet. Rule 1: I ate last. After Ethan, Jessica, and Lily had finished their meal in the warm, bright dining room, I would be called, not by name, but by a single, sharp rap on the connecting door. I would enter the silent kitchen, the air still smelling of their food, their laughter a phantom echo. My plate was always set at the corner of the granite island, away from the table. It was one of the old dishes from my house, a stoneware plate with a hairline crack and a small chip on the rim. Jessica said it was sentimental. I knew it was so I wouldn't risk breaking her perfect white porcelain. The food was whatever was left over: a single dry chicken breast, a spoonful of cold mashed potatoes. The vibrant green beans from their plates reduced to a pale, limp pile on mine. I ate standing up, looking out the window at the manicured lawn I had paid for. It was easier than sitting at the empty table, a ghost at a feast that had already ended. Rule 2 arrived with the first of the month. My Social Security check. For 45 years, that modest deposit had been a quiet symbol of my independence. Now it was a source of shame. Ethan sat me down in his sterile home office, a place of gray walls and glass desks. He had a spreadsheet open on his giant monitor. "Mom," he began, his voice laced with the patient tone one uses for a difficult child. "It would just be so much easier if we streamlined things to manage the household expenses." He explained a plan. My check would be deposited directly into his and Jessica's joint account. They would manage it for me, ensuring all my needs were met and my portion of the bills was covered. "It just simplifies the bookkeeping," he said, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You won't have to worry about a thing." I didn't say that I had never worried about it. I had managed a household budget for nearly 50 years. I had balanced checkbooks, paid mortgages, and saved for a future I thought would be my own. But I saw the set of his jaw, the finality in his posture. Arguing would be pointless. It would be framed as me being difficult, ungrateful. So I signed the papers he slid across the glass desk. I watched my last piece of autonomy, my name and my money, flow away from me and into his control. I felt like a dry leaf, severed from the tree, waiting for the wind to carry me away. He never gave me a receipt. I never saw a single bill. My needs were apparently the chipped plate and the cold leftovers. My only light in this deepening twilight was Lily, my granddaughter. She was 16, a whirlwind of vibrant life in a house that felt increasingly like a mausoleum. Sometimes, when Ethan and Jessica were out, she would sneak into the garage apartment. She'd bring me a warm cookie, still soft from the oven, or a glass of real, cold milk, not the water I was usually left with. "Grandma," she'd whisper, her eyes wide with a teenager's earnestness. "Tell me about the maps again." I would pull out my old drafting tools, the familiar weight of them, a comfort in my hands. I'd unroll a yellowed map of a place I had charted decades ago, a forgotten coastline in South America. I'd tell her how I used to find the hidden stories of the land, the way a river's bend told a tale of ancient geology, how a mountain's shadow could hide a village for 1,000 years. Her face would be rapt with attention, a stark contrast to the polite, vacant looks I received from her parents. She saw me. Not the burden, not the silent old woman in the garage, but Chloe Vance, the cartographer. These moments were my oxygen. They were also numbered. I started to notice a change, a subtle shift in the air when Lily was around her parents. One afternoon, Lily was helping me water the small potted herbs I kept on my windowsill when Jessica walked in. "Lily, honey, don't bother your grandmother," she said, her voice dripping with saccharine concern. "She needs her rest. You know how tired she gets." Lily looked from her mother to me, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. I wasn't tired. I was more alive in that moment than I had been all week. Another time, I heard Ethan talking to her in the hallway. "You have to be patient with Grandma," he said, his voice low and serious. "She's not as sharp as she used to be. Things can be very confusing for her now." He was drawing a new map for her, a map where I was a fragile, fading territory, a land of confusion and memory loss. They were slowly, methodically erasing the woman Lily knew and replacing her with a caricature of old age, a feeble creature who needed to be managed and eventually put away. Lily started visiting less. Her knocks became softer, her stays shorter. The light was dimming. The silent abuse began to find its voice. It was in the heavy, performative sighs from Ethan whenever I asked a simple question, like what day the trash was collected. The sigh was an announcement to the entire house. The burden is speaking again. It was in the way Jessica would walk behind me and spray a cloud of floral air freshener, wrinkling her nose and muttering just loud enough for me to hear, "I have to get rid of that old person's smell." I didn't smell. I showered every day. I kept my small apartment spotless. The smell she was trying to erase was the smell of my existence. It was the scent of a past she wanted to bury, a life she wanted to pave over. I became an expert in invisibility, in making myself smaller, quieter. I learned the floorboards that didn't creak, the times of day they were out of the house. The garage became less of an apartment and more of a hiding place. The turning point happened on a Tuesday. I was carrying my chipped plate to the sink, my hands slick from the cheap dish soap they left out for me. It slipped. The crash was deafening in the otherwise silent house. It shattered on the Italian tile, a spray of ceramic shards skittering under the cabinets. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then I heard footsteps. Jessica appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold fury. "Honestly, Chloe," she snapped, "this is exactly why we can't have you using the good china." Her words hit me harder than the fall. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I knelt, my old knees protesting, and began picking up the larger pieces. "I'll clean it up," I mumbled, not looking at her. Ethan appeared behind her. He didn't say a word to me. He just put a hand on Jessica's shoulder and guided her back into the living room, as if I were a mess on the floor and not a person. I was on my hands and knees, reaching for a shard of pottery under the lip of the kitchen island, when their voices drifted from the other room. They must have thought I had gone back to my apartment. Their words were low, but the pristine acoustics of their open-plan house carried them to me as clearly as if they were standing beside me. "This is getting impossible, Ethan." Jessica's voice was a venomous whisper. "She's a liability. What if she starts talking to someone? What if she figures it out?" My hand froze, hovering over a piece of the broken plate. "Figures what out?" A cold dread, colder than the tile floor, began to seep into my bones. Then came my son's voice, tired and strained. "She won't. We just have to keep her quiet." "It's only for another 6 months." 6 months. The number hung in the air, a specific calculated timeline. Quiet for 6 months. Jessica wasn't satisfied. 6 months until what, Ethan? Until the final payment audit goes through and we're in the clear? Audit. Final payment. The words were technical, financial. They didn't belong in a conversation about an elderly mother. They belonged in a boardroom or an insurance investigation. "Yes," Ethan confirmed, his voice dropping even lower, heavy with a terrible finality. "Once that's done, it's done. No one can touch the money. Or us. The money. My husband's death. The workplace accident. The insurance policy, I was told, had been minimal, barely enough to cover funeral expenses. The money I'd used from selling my own home to build this one for them. The pieces were scattered around me, just like the shards of the broken plate. But now, in the horrifying silence of my son's kitchen, they were starting to fit together. A new map was taking shape in my mind. It was not a map of earth and stone, but one of deceit and betrayal. And at its dark, rotten center was my own son. I remained kneeling on the floor, hidden in the shadow of the island, long after their voices had faded. The broken piece of my old life was still in my hand, its sharp edge pressing into my palm. I didn't feel the pain. I felt nothing but a vast, terrifying clarity. I was not a guest in their home. I was a prisoner, a placeholder, a silent witness they were waiting to discard. And the clock was ticking. 6 months. My name is Chloe Vance. I am 70 years old. For 45 of those years, my life was a map I drew with my husband, Robert. I was a cartographer by trade, a creator of worlds on paper, but he was my true north. Our life together was a landscape of shared dreams, marked by the laughter of our son, Ethan, and the quiet comfort of a home we built not with wood and nails, but with love and sacrifice. Robert was a structural engineer, a man who understood foundations, and he built ours to last, or so I thought. When we lost him, it wasn't just my husband who died. It was the world I knew. The map was torn, the compass spun wildly, and I was lost. After he was gone, the silence in our home was a physical weight. It was in the empty chair across the breakfast table, in the scent of his sawdust and oil that no longer clung to the air in the garage. Ethan and his wife Jessica were my only remaining landmarks. When they came to me with their proposition, their voices were filled with such earnest concern. They spoke of a new beginning, a multi-generational home where I would never be alone. "We'll build it together, Mom," Ethan had said, his eyes mirroring the sincerity I so desperately wanted to see. "You sell this old place, we'll pool our resources, and you'll have a beautiful suite. You'll be with us, with Lily. We'll take care of you." I saw it as the final loving chapter of the map Robert and I had started. I sold the house, the repository of my entire life with him, every penny from it, every last dollar from our shared life. I handed over to them. I wasn't just giving them money, I was giving them my trust, my future, the last piece of the world Robert and I had charted together. I believed I was securing a place in my family's heart. I didn't realize I was simply funding the construction of my own gilded cage. The move happened quickly. In the beginning, there was a flurry of manufactured warmth. Jessica would ask my opinion on paint colors she had already chosen. Ethan would kiss my cheek on his way out the door. But soon, the gloss of their welcome wore thin, revealing the hard, cold surface beneath. My existence slowly became governed by a series of unspoken, yet rigidly enforced rules. It began with the meals. The first few weeks we ate together. Then, one evening, Jessica announced they were having a date night in after I'd gone to bed. The next day, it was a special meal for just the three of them because Lily had done well on a test. Soon, it became the standard. I was to wait in my room, the converted garage, until they were finished. Only then was I permitted to enter the kitchen. My place at the table was no longer set. Instead, a single plate would be waiting on the counter, usually with the remnants of their dinner, lukewarm and lonely. It was always the same plate, a heavy ceramic disc with a blue floral pattern marred by a hairline crack that ran from the rim to the center. It was a plate they never used for themselves or for guests. It was my plate. The fork and knife beside it were from a mismatched set, the fork's tine slightly bent, the knife's edge dull. I would sit alone at the vast, polished dining table, the ghost of family laughter still hanging in the air, and eat my solitary meal from my chipped plate. It was a clear, daily message. You are other. You are less. Then came the issue of money. My Social Security checks, my only source of income, my final thread of independence, were rerouted. Ethan sat me down one afternoon, his tone patient and patronizing, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "Mom, it's just so much easier this way," he explained, holding a form for me to sign. "We'll have it deposited directly into our main account. That way, all the household expenses are covered in one place. You won't have to worry about a thing." I trusted him. What reason did I have not to? He was my son. I signed the paper. From that day on, I had no money of my own. If I needed toiletries, I had to ask Jessica, who would sigh and make a note on a shopping list, often forgetting the item for a week or two. I was a 70-year-old woman, reduced to asking for an allowance that never came. My only solace in that cold, beautiful house was my granddaughter, Lily. At 16, she was a whirlwind of teenage angst and surprising moments of grace. She still had Robert's eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown. Sometimes, she would slip into my room after school, closing the door softly behind her, and we would talk. She'd tell me about her classes, the boy she liked, her dreams of being a writer. In those moments, I felt a flicker of the old world, the one where I was Chloe, a grandmother, a person. But even that small comfort was being poisoned. I could see the lessons her parents were teaching her taking root. She started to look at me with a mixture of love and pity, as if I were a fragile heirloom that might break at any moment. The messages from Jessica started coming through her. It was a cruel and effective way to strip me of my agency. "Lily, can you tell your grandmother her TV is too loud? It's giving me a headache," Jessica would call from the other room, her voice loud enough for me to hear perfectly. Lily would then appear at my door, her face a mask of discomfort. "Grandma," she'd whisper, "Mom says, can you turn the TV down?" Each time, it was a small cut, severing the direct line of communication between me and my daughter-in-law, forcing my granddaughter to be the reluctant messenger of my irrelevance. I was no longer a person to be addressed, but a problem to be managed through an intermediary. The abuse was insidious because it was so quiet. It wasn't in shouting matches or overt cruelty. It was in the 1,000 tiny dismissals that accumulated day after day. It was in the heavy, theatrical sigh Ethan would let out whenever I started a sentence with a question, a sound that told me my curiosity was an imposition. It was in the way he and Jessica would exchange a glance over my head when I took too long to get out of a chair, a silent conversation about my physical decline. Their cruelty was a low-grade fever, a constant, draining ache that left me perpetually exhausted and questioning my own worth. The most cutting moments were the ones I was not meant to witness. One afternoon, I walked into the living room as Jessica was on a FaceTime call with one of her friends, her voice bright and animated. She didn't see me standing in the doorway. "Oh my God, Karen, you have no idea," she said, laughing a brittle, humorless laugh. "The whole house just has this smell of old age now. I'm constantly buying air fresheners. It just clings to everything." I froze, my hand on the doorframe. The smell of old age. She was talking about me. I quietly backed away, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I went to my room, closed the door, and brought the collar of my cardigan to my nose. I smelled of soap and the lavender sachet Lily had given me for Christmas. But in that moment, all I could smell was shame. I felt like I was decaying from the inside out, my very presence a foul odor in my own home. The turning point, the moment the quiet war became something more sinister, happened on a Tuesday night. The house was dark, everyone asleep. I couldn't settle. A familiar ache in my hip was keeping me awake. I decided to get a glass of water, maybe find the pain relievers I had to keep in the kitchen because Jessica didn't want a pharmacy in my room. I moved as silently as I could, my feet in their worn slippers, making no sound on the cold tile floor. My hand, perhaps unsteady from a lack of sleep, fumbled as I reached for a glass on the open shelf. It slipped from my grasp. The shatter was explosive in the stillness of the night. It sounded like a gunshot, a violent tearing of the silence. My breath caught in my chest. I immediately knelt, my old knees protesting, and began to carefully pick up the larger shards, my fingers trembling. I was a trespasser, a clumsy old woman who had disturbed the peace. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. I ducked my head, bracing for the inevitable sigh from Ethan, the sharp reprimand from Jessica. They stopped in the hallway, just out of my sightline from the kitchen entrance. Their voices were hushed, venomous whispers, not meant for my ears. "I can't take this anymore," Jessica hissed, her voice a blade in the dark. "Look at her. She's a liability. Just be patient." Ethan's voice was low, strained. "How much longer do we have to deal with this? The audit for the final payout is in 6 months. We just need to keep her quiet until then." I went completely still, a large, sharp piece of glass held tightly in my hand. The words hung in the air, refracting the reality of my situation into 1,000 sharp, terrifying pieces. An audit? A final payout? Keep me quiet. It wasn't about my age or my clumsiness. It wasn't about me being a burden. This was something else. This was calculated. There was a deadline, a 6-month timeline tied to a sum of money so significant they were willing to endure my presence for it. My mind reeled, trying to map this new, terrifying territory. The money I had given them was gone, used to build this house. So what payout were they waiting for? The blood drained from my face as a cold, horrifying thought began to form, a shadow that had been lurking at the edge of my consciousness ever since Robert's accident. My son and his wife weren't just mistreating me. They were waiting for something. And for some reason, my silence was the price of admission. As I knelt there on the cold floor, surrounded by the shattered remains of a simple water glass, I finally understood. I wasn't a guest in their home. I was a hostage. The days after I overheard their conversation became a special kind of hell, a landscape of quiet, suffocating tension. The air in the house grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. Every time Ethan walked past me, his failure to meet my eyes was a physical weight. Every time Jessica smiled her brittle, perfect smile, it felt like she was checking to see if I had cracked yet. The 6-month deadline they had mentioned hung in the air like an executioner's axe, but I didn't know what it meant. I only knew that I was a problem to be managed, a loose end to be tied up. My existence had been whittled down to a series of demeaning rituals. Mealtimes were the worst. They would sit at the large oak dining table Robert and I had picked out decades ago, its surface gleaming under the recessed lighting Jessica had insisted on. Ethan at the head, Jessica to his right, Lily to his left, a perfect self-contained triangle. I was not part of the geometry. My place was a small wooden stool at the far end of the kitchen island, a satellite orbiting their world. I was given a plate, but only after they had served themselves, often with whatever was left in the serving dishes. Sometimes, Jessica would slide it onto the granite countertop without a word, the scrape of the ceramic on stone, a sound of dismissal. The plate was always the same, a chipped melamine one from a set I didn't recognize, the kind you buy for camping. They ate with heavy silver cutlery. I was given a plastic spork. One evening, Lily had asked, "Grandma, why don't you sit with us?" Before I could answer, Jessica's voice, sweet as poison, cut in. "Honey, Grandma is more comfortable over there. She has more space, don't you, Chloe?" She didn't look at me when she said it. She was looking at Lily, teaching her the family's unwritten rules, teaching her that I was other, an outsider. Lily looked down at her plate, a flicker of confusion in her young eyes, and the subject was dropped. The small cruelties were relentless, like a slow, steady drip of water on stone. My pension, which I had naively agreed to have direct deposited into their joint account to help with expenses, had vanished into the black hole of their lifestyle. When I once meekly asked Ethan if I could have $20 to buy a new book of crossword puzzles, he sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of manufactured burden. "Mom, everything is taken care of. You don't need cash. Jessica buys everything you need." But she didn't. My clothes were threadbare, my shoes worn. The old person smell Jessica complained about was the scent of soap from the dollar store, because the lavender body wash I loved was deemed an unnecessary luxury. The television in my garage apartment was programmed to lock after 9 p.m. "It's for your own good," Jessica had explained, patting my hand with fingers that felt like cold glass. "We don't want you staying up too late and getting overtired." I was a 70-year-old woman with a bedtime. Then one gray afternoon, a few weeks into this new, heightened state of dread, the mail arrived. Usually it was a stack of glossy catalogs for Jessica and bills for Ethan. But that day, nestled between a credit card offer and a political flyer, was a single, plain white envelope. It was thin, almost weightless. My name, Chloe Vance, was written on the front in a shaky, spidery script. There was no return address. My heart, a dull and sluggish muscle for so long, gave a strange, painful lurch. It was an anomaly. A message from a world outside these walls. I tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan, my fingers trembling, and retreated to the garage. Sitting on the edge of my lumpy mattress, I carefully tore it open. Inside was a sympathy card. The front showed a watercolor painting of a weeping willow. It was 2 years late. I opened it, my eyes scanning the generic printed sentiment about loss and memory. But at the bottom, below the printed words, was a single sentence scrawled in the same unsteady hand as the address. The ink was a faded blue. Robert was worried about the new safety protocols. He said Ethan was pushing them through too fast. I'm sorry I stayed silent. It was signed, Frank Miller. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. Frank. I remembered him, a quiet, steady man who had worked with Robert for 30 years. He'd been at the funeral, his face a mask of grief. The words on the card didn't just sit on the page, they burned. They rearranged the entire landscape of my past. The official report. I could see it in my mind's eye, the cold, bureaucratic text. Faulty harness. Unforeseeable equipment failure. An act of God, a tragic accident. But this letter was not about an act of God. It was about an act of man. My own son. Ethan was a project manager at the firm. He had risen quickly. I remembered him boasting about streamlining operations, cutting costs, increasing efficiency. He had signed off on those protocols, the protocols that had failed, the harness that had snapped, the husband that had fallen. My blood didn't just run cold. It turned to ice, freezing me from the inside out. The house I had paid for, the abuse I was enduring. Was this all blood money? Was my silence the price for my son's ambition? The overheard conversation about the final payment audit suddenly clicked into a terrifying new context. It wasn't just about my pension. It was bigger, so much bigger. And my first, desperate instinct was to find him, to find Frank, to hear his voice, to understand what he wasn't saying in that single, devastating sentence. The world had shrunk to the four walls of this house and the small, cold garage, but the internet was a window, a door. I waited until long after the house fell silent. The rhythmic hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a mechanical heartbeat in the dark. I crept out of the garage, my bare feet cold on the polished concrete floor, and slipped into the main house. The glow of the security system's keypad by the door was a single, malevolent red eye. I tiptoed into the living room, where Jessica's sleek silver laptop sat closed on the coffee table. My own tablet, a gift from them last Christmas, was useless. It was a child's device, locked down and neutered. My hands shook as I lifted the laptop's lid. The screen flared to life, illuminating my face in its cold blue light. I felt like a thief, an intruder. I opened the web browser, my fingers fumbling on the trackpad. I typed, Frank Miller, Construction, New York, into the search bar. My heart hammered against my ribs. The search results began to populate, a list of possibilities. And then, before I could click a single link, the screen was wiped clean and replaced by a large, cartoonish graphic of a padlock. A cheerful, condescending message appeared in a bubbly font. Oops, looks like you're trying to access something off-limits. This computer is protected by Safe FamilyNet to ensure a safe and secure browsing experience. Below the message was a smaller line of text. This setting is managed by Jessica Vance. I stared at the screen, the cheerful padlock mocking me. It was her. Of course, it was her. The parental controls she'd said were to protect me from online scams were a cage, a digital cage built around my mind. I tried again, searching for the engineering firm's public records. Padlock. I tried searching for news articles about Robert's accident from 2 years ago. Padlock. Every avenue I took, every attempt to find a crack of light in this suffocating darkness, was met with Jessica's smiling digital warden. Defeated, I lowered the laptop lid, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I looked around the room. The smart home hub on the counter blinked softly. The security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling had a tiny green light, indicating it was active. They weren't just monitoring my browsing history, they were monitoring me. Every camera, every microphone, every smart device was a silent guard in my prison. My phone was on their family plan. They could see every call, every text. The walls weren't just plaster and wood, they were circuits and signals. A web of control spun so tightly around me I could barely breathe. I was digitally suffocated, buried alive in a tomb of their own making. There was no escape. If they had built a cage of wires and signals, then I would have to use my own voice. I would have to face them directly. The knowledge was a cold stone in my gut. I knew it was foolish. I knew they would twist it. But the silence Frank had apologized for was now my own, and it was choking me. I waited until the next evening. I held the letter in my cardigan pocket all day, its sharp corners a constant pressing reminder against my hip. Dinner was the usual humiliating affair. Ethan was talking about a potential promotion, his voice full of self-importance. Jessica was praising him, her eyes shining with a covetous gleam. Lily was picking at her food, quiet and withdrawn. I sat on my stool, a spectator to their lives, I cleared my throat. The sound was small, but in a brief lull in their conversation, it was enough. 3 pairs of eyes turned to me. It felt like being pinned by spotlights. "Ethan," I began, my voice a dry whisper. I had to clear it again. I received a letter." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at the interruption. "A letter? From who?" My hand trembled as I pulled Frank's card from my pocket. I held it out. The flimsy cardstock shook between my fingers. "From Frank Miller, Dad's old colleague." Ethan's face tightened. He didn't take the card. He just stared at my hand. Jessica's smile became fixed, a painted-on mask. "He said..." My voice faltered. I looked down at the weeping willow on the card. "He said Dad was worried about the new safety protocols. He said you were pushing them through too fast." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a crushing, physical force. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to die away. Then, Ethan let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was a sound of dismissal, sharp and cruel as a shard of glass. "Oh, Mom." He shook his head, leaning back in his chair and picking up his wine glass. He looked at Jessica, a shared knowing glance passing between them. "Frank Miller, of course. Frank's been a disgruntled employee for years. He was bitter he never got the promotion Dad did. He'll say anything." He took a sip of wine. "And you know how Dad was. A world-class worrier. He worried if the coffee was too hot. You can't take this stuff to heart." He waved a dismissive hand at the letter I was still holding. "Honestly, your grief is making you confused. It's been 2 years. It's understandable, but you're letting your imagination run away with you." Every word was a calculated blow, designed to make me feel small, foolish, and unstable. He wasn't just denying it. He was rewriting my reality, painting me as a hysterical, grieving widow. The rage that had been simmering inside me for months threatened to boil over, but it was doused by a sudden, chilling touch. Jessica had gotten up from the table and walked over to me. She put her arm around my shoulders, her perfectly manicured hand resting on my arm. Her touch felt like ice. "Honey," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, a syrupy, cloying sound. "Ethan's right. You've been through so much. You're not thinking clearly." She squeezed my arm gently, a gesture that was meant to look like comfort, but felt like a threat. "Maybe we should make an appointment with Dr. Miller. He could adjust your medication, just to help you feel more like yourself again." The gaslighting was so blatant, so perfectly executed, it was breathtaking. They worked in tandem, a well-oiled machine of psychological abuse. He was the hammer, she was the velvet glove hiding a fist of iron. He made me the villain, she made me the patient. Together, they were trying to convince me that I was insane, that my perception of the world was broken, that the truth, clutched in my shaking hand, was a figment of a grief-addled mind. I looked from Ethan's smug, dismissive face to Jessica's mask of predatory sympathy. I looked at my granddaughter, Lily, who was watching us with wide, uncertain eyes, learning another lesson in how to treat the woman who was a burden. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The helpless despair I'd been drowning in for 2 years didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It hardened into a cold, sharp point of clarity. They wouldn't listen. They would just push me further down, label me, medicate me, and lock me away in a fog of their own making until their final payment came through. They weren't just trying to control me, they were trying to erase me. And I understood, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I was going to survive, I couldn't fight them head on. Not anymore. I had to disappear. I had to become the confused, forgetful old woman they wanted me to be. I had to chart my own map out of this prison, one secret observation at a time. I lowered my hand, letting the letter from Frank fall to my lap. I let my shoulders slump. I looked up at Jessica, allowing a flicker of manufactured confusion to cloud my eyes. "Maybe you're right," I whispered. I do feel very tired." They thought my mind was a landscape of fog and shadows, a territory where memories faded like coastlines into the mist. I decided to let them believe it. I would become the ghost in my own home, a vessel of benign confusion. It was an act, of course, the performance of a lifetime, and it began with the smallest of gestures. The next morning, I asked Jessica where I had put my reading glasses. They were, as I knew perfectly well, perched on top of my head. She sighed, a sound as sharp and dismissive as a paper cut. "They're on your head, Chloe." Again. I gave a small, startled laugh, patting my hair with a trembling hand. "Oh, goodness me. I'd lose my own head if it weren't screwed on." It was a phrase my own mother used to use, a relic from a past that felt a million miles away. Jessica didn't smile. She just turned back to her laptop, her fingers clicking with an impatient rhythm against the keys. Her world was one of efficiency and forward momentum. I was a broken-down engine left by the side of the road. From that day on, I embraced the role. I became a student of frailty. I would stand in the middle of the living room, a vacant look on my face, as if I'd forgotten my destination between the kitchen and my small garage apartment. I'd leave the tea kettle to whistle its shrill, frantic song until Ethan, with an exasperated sigh, would storm into the kitchen to snatch it off the burner. "Mom, you're going to burn the house down," he'd say, his voice tight with a frustration he barely tried to conceal. I would just look at him, my eyes wide with a carefully practiced innocence. Oh dear. I was just about to get it. My mind must have wandered. His frustration was a tool. Their impatience was my cover. While they saw a deteriorating mind, I was doing what I had done my entire professional life. I was drawing a map, not of mountains and rivers, but of their lives, their routines, their secrets. The house was no longer a home. It was a grid, and I was charting every coordinate. I was a silent cartographer, and this was my most important project. I learned the subtle acoustics of the house. I knew the specific creak of the floorboard outside Ethan's home office that signaled he was getting up from his desk. I knew the soft whoosh of Jessica's laptop closing at precisely 10:17 p.m. every night, followed by the faint blue glow of her phone in the dark. These were my new landmarks, the topography of my confinement. My greatest breakthrough came during one of Jessica's marathon phone calls with a friend. She was pacing in the kitchen, complaining about a caterer for some upcoming event. I was pretending to be engrossed in a gardening magazine at the dining table, my head bowed in concentration. But my ears were tuned to her, filtering out the drone of the television. She needed to confirm an online payment, and she rattled off a string of numbers and letters to her friend. A password, not for her bank, but for something else, something she called her life hub. I didn't dare reach for a pen. Instead, I committed it to memory, chanting it silently in my head, using an old mnemonic trick Robert had taught me for remembering complex coordinates. Alpha Juliet 773 Echo Bravo. I pictured an Alfa Romeo car, driven by Juliet, followed by 2 sevens on a lucky slot machine, an Echo in a cave, and a braid of brown hair. AJ773EB. It was seared into my brain. The next day, while Jessica was at her yoga class and Ethan was at work, I staged another accident. I accidentally spilled a glass of water on my worn-out tablet, the one they'd given me for my birthday 3 years ago. I let out a small, theatrical cry of distress. When Jessica returned, I showed her the dead screen with a look of utter desolation. "Oh, Jessica, I'm so clumsy. It just slipped." She rolled her eyes, the gesture so blatant it was almost comical. "For God's sake, Chloe. Fine, you can use my old laptop if you have to, but don't mess anything up. It's for emergencies only." She set it up for me on the small, wobbly desk in my garage room. An older model, but it was a gateway. That night, long after the house had fallen silent, I powered it on. The screen asked for a password. My heart hammered against my ribs. I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the keys. I typed in the sequence I had memorized. AJ773EB. Enter. The screen flickered and the desktop appeared. I was in. A wave of triumph, cold and sharp, washed over me. It wasn't the giddy thrill of victory. It was the grim satisfaction of a key turning in a lock. I wasn't just browsing her files. I was exploring the architecture of their betrayal. On the calendar, I saw their appointments, scribbled in a digital shorthand. Meeting, WM. I didn't know what WM stood for, not yet. I saw dinner reservations, Lily's orthodontist appointments, and then a recurring entry. Call with BR. The calls were scheduled every 2 weeks. My search continued. In a folder marked Household, I found scans of documents, insurance policies, bank statements, and a file simply labeled The Estate. My hands were shaking as I clicked it open. It was a digital copy of the agreement I had signed, the one where I'd handed over the proceeds from the sale of my house, my home of 40 years, the house I had shared with Robert. Seeing my own signature, faint and digital, felt like looking at the signature of a ghost, a foolish, trusting ghost. A few days later, I was clearing the mail from the front hall table, another of my designated chores. A letter, thick and formal, had slipped from the main pile and lay half-hidden under a Pottery Barn catalog. It was addressed to Ethan. In the top left corner was the embossed name of a firm, Davenport Wealth Management. WM. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I shouldn't. I knew the risk. But the cartographer in me, the part of me that needed to see the whole map, couldn't resist. My fingers, clumsy with a tremor that was no longer feigned, carefully worked open the unsealed flap. It wasn't a statement. It was a summary, a projection of assets. I scanned the columns of figures, the jargon about portfolios and returns, and then I saw it. A line item listed under Anticipated Inflows. It had a date, 6 months from now. And next to it, a number that made the air leave my lungs, $4 million. And in the notes section, a single chilling phrase, pending final audit, R. Vance case. The audit for the final payment they had whispered about. Robert's case. It wasn't just about his death, it was about a payout, a massive one, a payout they were waiting for, a payout contingent on something. I carefully slid the letter back into the envelope, my mind racing. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture so monstrous I could barely look at it. They needed me quiet, compliant, and out of the way for 6 more months. They needed the world to believe Robert's death was a tragic, unavoidable accident with no corporate liability. My son, the man who had overseen the very safety protocols Robert had been worried about, stood to gain a fortune from his father's death. The knowledge was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, cold and heavy as a slab of granite. My digital cage was suffocating. Jessica had installed parental controls on my old tablet and my phone was on their family plan, its data usage a line item on their monthly bill. Every search I made, every site I visited was theoretically visible to them. They'd framed it as a way to protect me from scams, but I knew it for what it was, a leash. To find Frank, Robert's old colleague, the man who had sent that cryptic, worrying letter, I needed to step outside their walls. I needed neutral ground. The public library became my sanctuary and my battleground. Planning the excursion took a week. I had to wait for the perfect confluence of events. A day when Ethan was at an all-day off-site meeting and Jessica was taking Lily for a college tour 2 towns over. I told Jessica I wasn't feeling well, that I would just stay in my room and rest. It was the perfect excuse. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I was in motion. I put on my most nondescript coat, a simple scarf, and the walking shoes I hadn't worn in a year. The bus ride was a blur of unfamiliar streets and faces. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was anonymous. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every person who glanced my way felt like a potential spy. The library was an old brick building, smelling of aging paper and floor polish. It was a smell from my childhood, a scent of safety and possibility. But as I walked towards the public computer terminals, my heart pounded with a new kind of fear. These were not the card catalogs of my youth. They were portals to a world where I was a clumsy trespasser. I sat down at a vacant carrel, the plastic chair cold against my legs. I stared at the screen, a generic landscape photo as its wallpaper. This was it. My first attempts were clumsy and fruitless. I searched for Frank Miller on Facebook, scrolling through hundreds of profiles of smiling, unfamiliar men. Young men posing with fish, old men on golf courses, middle-aged men with their families. None of them felt like Robert's Frank, the serious, methodical engineer I vaguely remembered from company picnics years ago. I tried LinkedIn, but the results were a wash of corporate headshots and impenetrable job titles. The digital world felt like a fortress, and I didn't have the key. I could feel the precious minutes ticking away. Jessica and Lily would be home in a few hours. Panic began to set in, cold and prickly. I was failing. This was a fool's errand. I was just an old woman playing detective, and I was out of my depth. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think, to map the problem. Robert wasn't a social media person. Frank probably wasn't either. They were engineers. They belonged to a different world, one built on schematics and stress tolerances, not selfies and status updates. Where would a man like that connect with his peers? I changed my search terms. Instead of his name, I searched for his tribe. Retired Civil Engineers Forum. Structural Engineering Discussion Board. The search results were a list of dry, technical-sounding websites. I clicked on the first one. The Integrated Engineer, a forum for professionals. The site was rudimentary, mostly text, with a simple, outdated layout. It felt right. I used the search function within the forum, my hands shaking slightly as I typed in his name. One result, a username, F. Miller. His last post was 3 weeks ago, a long, detailed comment on a thread about outdated concrete reinforcement techniques. It was him. I knew it. The tone was precise, knowledgeable, a little cantankerous. It was the voice of an expert. To contact him, I had to create a profile. The form asked for my name, my email, my engineering specialty. I froze. I couldn't use my own name. I created a new anonymous email address on a free service, something I'd seen Lily do once. For the profile, I became Anna Peters. For my specialty, I wrote historical archives. It was the truest thing I could think of. Then came the message. It had to be perfect, vague enough to protect me, but specific enough to hook him. I typed, deleted, and retyped for what felt like an hour. Subject, a question about Robert Vance. Mr. Miller, you don't know me. My name is Anna. I am helping to archive the personal effects of a family member, and I came across some of my father's old work papers. He worked with you for many years. His name was Robert Vance. Before he passed away, he mentioned he was worried about something at work, something to do with new safety reports. I know this is a long shot, and I apologize for bothering you, but seeing your name on this forum, I felt I had to reach out. Anything you might remember would be a great help. Thank you for your time. Anna. I read it over a dozen times. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into a vast digital ocean. I clicked send. The screen confirmed the message was sent, and I just sat there, staring. I felt completely drained, as if I'd just run a marathon. There was nothing to do now but wait. I spent the next hour pretending to browse the internet, my eyes constantly flicking to the corner of the screen where a notification might appear. Nothing. The clock on the wall told me I had to leave. The journey home was agonizing. Every minute that passed felt like a confirmation of my failure. He wouldn't reply. Why would he? It was a strange message from a stranger about a man who had died 2 years ago. I returned to my garage prison just as the sun was beginning to set, the familiar despair settling over me like a shroud. I had risked everything for nothing. 2 days passed. The silence was deafening. I went through the motions of my role, the forgetful, harmless old woman. I spilled my juice at breakfast. I asked Ethan what day it was, 3 times. Each act of feigned senility felt more hollow, more pointless. My one gambit had failed. On the 3rd night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of my hopelessness was a physical presence in the dark room. On a whim, a desperate final impulse, I crept out of my room and into the quiet house. The old laptop was still on my desk. I opened it, the light from the screen hurting my eyes. I navigated back to the anonymous email account I had created, and there it was, one new message. From F. Miller. Subject, a question about Robert Vance. My breath hitched. My hands trembled so violently I could barely control the mouse to click it open. Anna. I remember Robert Vance very well. He was the best damn cartographer I ever knew, and a good man, an honest man. And you're right, he was worried. He was more than worried. He was terrified. He told me the new accelerated protocols that his own son was pushing through were a death trap. He said they were cutting corners on structural assessments to fast-track the projects and inflate the company's value before a merger. He filed 3 separate safety reports detailing the risks, begging them to reconsider. Management, with Ethan's signature on the approval, buried them. Robert knew they were ignoring him. The week before he died, he gave me a flash drive. He looked me in the eye and said, "Frank, if anything happens to me on that site, you make sure this sees the light of day. You make sure they know it wasn't an accident." I still have it. I have the copies of the original reports he filed, and because I'm a suspicious old bastard, I also got my hands on the official incident report and the altered safety assessments Ethan submitted after his death. The ones that cleared the company of all negligence. They're night and day. It's fraud, plain and simple. Criminal fraud. I don't know who you are, Anna, but if you're trying to find the truth about what happened to your father, I will help you. This has weighed on my conscience for 2 years. Let me know what you need. Frank. I read the email 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. It wasn't just tears of grief for Robert, but tears of a terrifying, righteous vindication. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. The map was finally complete, and its lines all pointed to one terrible, inescapable truth. I wasn't just living with my husband's memory. I was living in a house paid for by his death. The cold satisfaction I'd felt before was gone, replaced by a glacial rage. Frank's message wasn't a lifeline. It was a weapon. And now, I finally knew how to use it. My search for the truth had become bolder, fueled by Frank's confirmation. The correspondence with him was a secret current of energy running beneath the placid surface of my life. We communicated through the anonymous email account, always from the library. I had to document everything. Frank sent me scanned copies of the documents he had. Robert's original, detailed reports, filled with his familiar, precise handwriting and meticulous diagrams. And next to them, the sanitized versions Ethan had submitted, stripped of all warnings, all concerns. The contrast was sickening. It was a forgery of reality itself. I used the library's printer, feeding it coin after coin, my hands shaking as the warm pages slid into the tray. Each sheet felt like a piece of my husband's stolen voice, returned to me. I had to have physical copies. I couldn't risk leaving the only proof on a flash drive or a public computer. I concealed the stack of papers inside a large print book on birdwatching and carried it home, my heart thudding with the weight of my illicit cargo. But I had grown careless. In my focus on the mission, I had forgotten the cartographer's first rule: always be aware of your own trail. A few days later, Ethan approached me while I was in the kitchen, carefully measuring out my portion of leftover casserole onto a chipped plate, long after they had finished their own dinner. He was holding a piece of paper, a credit card statement. His expression was one of practiced, condescending concern, a look I had come to despise. "Mom," he began, his voice soft, a surgeon's voice before delivering bad news. "Jessica and I were just going over the monthly bills. There are a few charges here from the public library." He held the statement out for me to see. 3 small charges, each for a few dollars. "For printing," the description read. "I didn't know you were working on a project. You know you can just ask me, and I can print anything you need right here in my office." The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. My mind raced, searching for a plausible lie. My carefully constructed persona of a doddering old woman was my only shield. "Oh," I said, looking down at the statement with feigned confusion. "The library? Yes. I was looking up some old recipes for a fruitcake. Your father loved my fruitcake, you know." I tried a nostalgic smile. "My recipe book is so old, the pages are falling out. I thought I would print out some new ones. My hands aren't so steady for writing anymore." He didn't look convinced. His eyes, so much like Robert's but colder, searched my face for a crack in the facade. "Fruitcake," he repeated slowly, as if the word itself was suspicious. "Right. Well, just let me know next time, okay? We don't want you tiring yourself out, taking the bus all that way. The threat was clear, wrapped in the language of care. "We're watching you." I knew something had shifted. My small act of rebellion had been detected. The net was tightening. The very next day, the consequence arrived. It came in a thick, cream-colored envelope, delivered by a courier who required a signature. Jessica signed for it, her brow furrowed. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Vance. She slid it open with a long, painted fingernail right there in the hallway. I watched from the kitchen doorway, pretending to wipe down the counter. I saw her face pale as she read. She looked up, and her eyes met mine. For a split second, her mask of polite indifference slipped, revealing a flicker of pure, unadulterated venom. Then it was gone. "Ethan," she called up the stairs, her voice strained. "You need to see this." He came down, and they stood together in the hall, whispering, their backs to me. I could only catch fragments. "Lawyer says it's the next logical step. Clear evidence of cognitive decline. For her own well-being." Later that afternoon, after a long, closed-door phone call in Ethan's office, he approached me again. This time, he was holding the letter. It was from their lawyer. He didn't try to hide it. He sat down opposite me at the kitchen table, a place we had not shared for a meal in over a year. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, folding his hands on the table. He looked, for all the world, like a son burdened with a painful duty. It was a masterful performance. "Jessica and I are worried about you, deeply worried. The memory lapses, the confusion, that business with the library. It's becoming clear that managing your own affairs is becoming too much for you." He pushed the letter across the table. "Our lawyer has helped us draw this up. It's a preliminary notice. We've scheduled an appointment to discuss setting up a conservatorship." The word hung in the air, clinical and brutal. Conservatorship. I had read about it. It meant they would have legal control over my finances, my medical decisions, my life. They would own me. I stared at the embossed letterhead of the law firm. It was a declaration of war. "This isn't a punishment, Mom," he continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "This is to protect you, to ensure you're taken care of, that your assets are managed properly for your future needs. We'll handle everything. You won't have to worry about a thing ever again." My blood ran cold. He was offering me a gilded cage, and this letter was the legal blueprint for its construction. I looked at the letter, the black ink on the page a series of bars locking me in. I saw the jargon, designed to intimidate and confuse. "Fiduciary responsibility, assessment of legal competence, in your best interest." They were going to have me declared legally incompetent, a woman with no mind of her own, with no voice, no rights. A non-person, the perfect, silent victim. I looked up from the letter and into my son's eyes. There was no love there, no concern. Only a cold, hard resolution. He was a man closing a business deal. I was the final troublesome asset to be liquidated. I picked up the letter. My hand was perfectly steady. "When is the appointment?" I asked, my voice a dry whisper. He seemed relieved by my placid reaction. "In 2 weeks, the day after Thanksgiving. We thought it would be best to get through the holiday first." Thanksgiving. The word struck me like a blow. It was their deadline, a day for family and gratitude, a day they had chosen to mark the beginning of the end of my freedom. I looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall. Jessica had circled the date in a cheerful red marker. A little turkey sticker was placed next to it. 14 days. The clock was ticking. They thought they were setting the terms of my surrender. They had no idea they were giving me a deadline for my attack. The silent cartographer now had her target, and I would map their destruction. The crisp autumn air that seeped through the thin weather stripping of my garage apartment door felt like a premonition. It was the season of endings, of things withering to make way for a harsh, cold truth. Inside the main house, however, it was the season of performance. Jessica was in her element, a general planning a grand campaign. Her battlefield was the dining room. Her weapons were floral arrangements and artisanal hors d'oeuvres. and her objective was the complete captivation of their social circle, most notably Ethan's boss. "Thanksgiving is everything this year, Ethan," I heard her say one evening, her voice carrying clearly from the kitchen into the living room where I sat, a forgotten book open in my lap. I was meant to be invisible, a piece of furniture that occasionally moved, and I had become very good at my role. "It's not just a dinner, it's a statement. Mr. Davenport is coming. His wife is on the board of the city's art museum. We need to project success, stability, perfection." Ethan's reply was a low murmur, the sound of a man trying to soothe a thoroughbred horse. "I know, Jess. It'll be great. You always do an amazing job." "It's all about perception," she'd chirped, and the word hung in the air, sharp and metallic. Perception. My world had been reduced to their perception of me, a frail, forgetful old woman, a benevolent burden they were graciously shouldering. It was a perception I had begun to cultivate with the same meticulous care I once used to ink the contour lines on a topographical map. A few days later, Jessica was at the polished quartz island in the kitchen, surrounded by swatches of linen napkins and stacks of expensive, cream-colored cardstock. She let out an exaggerated sigh, rubbing her temples. "I just have so much to do. The caterer, the florist, and I still have to write out all these invitations. My hand will be a claw by the time I'm done." This was my opening. I rose slowly from my armchair, shuffling my feet just enough to signal my approach. I let my shoulders slump, my head tilt in a gesture of gentle inquiry. "Invitations, dear?" I asked, my voice a little thin, a little reedy. "Oh, that sounds lovely." She glanced up, her expression a practiced blend of strained patience and superficial sweetness. "Yes, Chloe. For Thanksgiving. It's going to be a big affair." I reached out a slightly trembling hand and touched the corner of one of the cards. The paper was thick, textured, and smelled faintly of vanilla. "They're beautiful. Such lovely paper." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough. "You know, my penmanship was always considered quite fine. Robert used to say I could have been a calligrapher." I gave a soft, wistful sigh. It would give me something to do, to feel useful. I saw the flicker in her eyes. It was a quick calculation. The task was tedious. I was offering to do it for free. The risk of me making a mistake was offset by the convenience and the reinforcement of my role as a harmless, doddering elder, eager for any scrap of purpose. A faint, condescending smile touched her lips. "Well, Chloe, that's actually a very thoughtful offer. Are you sure you're up to it? It's a lot of writing." "Oh, I'll take my time," I said, mustering a watery smile. "I'll be very careful. It would be my pleasure to help." "All right," she said, her voice bright and decisive, the matter settled. She handed me the guest list, a sheet of paper printed from a spreadsheet, and a box of the invitations. "Here's the list of names and addresses. Just copy them exactly, and please, use the black ink pen, not the blue." "Of course, dear," I said, clutching the box to my chest as if it were a precious gift. "Thank you." I retreated to my small room in the garage, the cold concrete floor a constant reminder of my displacement. I didn't turn on the main light, preferring the focused beam of the small desk lamp Robert had given me years ago. It cast a pool of warm yellow light on the small particle board desk. The house was quiet. Ethan and Jessica had taken Lily to a soccer tournament, a calculated family outing designed to project flawless parental involvement. I was alone, truly alone. I laid out the invitations, the list, and the pen. One by one, I carefully transcribed the names she had provided: the Davenports, the Hendersons, the Parkers, names of people I didn't know, who would come to this house built with my life savings, eat a meal paid for by my stolen security, and witness a portrait of a happy family that was a masterful lie. My hand moved with a steadiness that would have shocked Jessica. The tremors were gone. The hesitation was an act. Here in the quiet solitude of my cell, the cartographer was at work. Every name was a point on a map of their world, their ambitions. After I had finished her list, I took a deep breath and pulled 2 more cards from the bottom of the box. My heart wasn't racing. Instead, it beat with a slow, heavy, and deliberate rhythm, like a drum marking the advance of an army. My hand was rock steady as I uncapped the pen. The first new card was for Frank, my dear, loyal Frank. His letter had been the first crack in the facade, the first indication that the ground beneath my feet was not just unstable, but deliberately sabotaged. I couldn't just invite him as Frank, my husband's old colleague, who thinks our son is a murderer. The invitation had to pass Jessica's inevitable inspection. I paused, thinking. Then I began to write, the ink flowing dark and smooth on the creamy paper. Mr. Frank Peterson. I added a small, handwritten note at the bottom, in a slightly more flowing personal script. Frank, my dear old friend from church, it would be such a joy to have you join us for the holiday. It's been too long. It was perfect, plausible, vague, utterly disarming. Jessica might find it a bit odd, this sudden appearance of a church friend she'd never heard of, but she would likely dismiss it as another symptom of my wandering mind, a forgotten acquaintance from a life she had no interest in. The second card required even more care. This was the wild card, the catalyst. Through the Elder Abuse Support Forum I'd found at the library, I had been put in touch with a journalist. Not some high-profile columnist, but a hungry, tenacious freelance reporter named Sarah Jenkins, who specialized in stories that fell through the cracks, stories of financial exploitation, of corporate malfeasance, of silenced victims. We had spoken on a prepaid phone I'd bought with cash from the small emergency fund I'd kept hidden for years. She was sharp, empathetic, and most importantly, she believed me. I couldn't invite a journalist to a private Thanksgiving dinner, but I could invite a guidance counselor. I wrote the name, Ms. Sarah Jenkins, and again, the crucial, disarming note at the bottom. Dear Miss Jenkins, Jessica and Ethan would be so delighted if you could join our family for Thanksgiving dinner. Lily speaks so highly of you, and we'd love to thank you in person for all the guidance you've provided her. This was my masterpiece. It appealed directly to Jessica's obsession with her daughter's success. The idea that Lily had a private guidance counselor, someone prestigious enough to warrant a personal invitation to their most important social event of the year, would be irresistible. She wouldn't question it. She would boast about it. She would see Sarah not as a threat, but as a status symbol. I carefully placed the 2 rogue invitations into the middle of the stack. I sealed all the envelopes, affixed the stamps I had bought myself, and placed the neat pile on the kitchen island for Jessica to find. The stage was being set. The actors were being summoned. And the lead performer, the grieving widow, was about to deliver the performance of a lifetime. In the days that followed, the days leading up to the Thanksgiving dinner, I dissolved. I let the vibrant, sharp-minded Chloe Vance, the woman who could navigate treacherous coastlines on paper and in life, fade into the background. In her place, I allowed a ghost to emerge, a specter of my former self, designed to lull my captors into a state of absolute complacency. My performance was not in grand gestures, but in 1,000 tiny, heartbreaking details. I began leaving things in odd places. The television remote in the refrigerator, a half-read book in the pantry. I would stand in the middle of a room, a look of profound confusion on my face, as if I had forgotten how I got there or what I intended to do. Mom, are you okay? Ethan would ask, his voice laced with a weary, put-upon concern that was for an audience of one, his wife. Oh, I would say, blinking slowly. Yes, dear, I was just looking for the thing, you know. The clicker. It's in your hand, Mom, he'd say gently, and I would look down at my own hand with what I hoped looked like genuine surprise. Jessica would watch these exchanges from a distance, her arms crossed, a small, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She would catch Ethan's eye and give a slight shake of her head, a silent conversation passing between them that screamed, "See? I told you, she's getting worse." I honed my blank stare. I would sit in my armchair for an hour at a time, my eyes fixed on the dark screen of the television, my expression placid and empty. I learned to let my jaw go slack just slightly, to let my hands rest limply in my lap. They started talking over me, then through me, as if I were no longer a person but a part of the room's decor. Their whispers grew louder, more careless. They were insulated by my perceived incompetence. I was the perfect secret keeper because they believed I no longer had the capacity to understand the secrets I was hearing. The kitchen became my primary listening post. I would doze in the armchair in the adjacent living room, my breathing slow and even, a soft, wheezing sound that I practiced in the privacy of my garage. It was the sound of old age, of decline. It was the sound of invisibility. One evening, about a week before Thanksgiving, they were in the kitchen celebrating. Ethan had come home with a bottle of expensive wine, the kind they only drank for special occasions. Lily was upstairs, music leaking from under her door. It was just the three of us in the house, two predators and their willing, silent prey. Davenport's assistant called today, Ethan said, his voice brimming with a nervous excitement. He confirmed. He and his wife are really looking forward to it. Of course they are, Jessica purred. The sound of a cork popping, followed by the glug-glug of wine being poured into glasses. I ordered the heritage turkey, and the centerpiece is going to have orchids. It's going to be perfect. It has to be, Ethan said, his voice dropping lower. This isn't just about making an impression, Jess. It's the final stretch. I kept my breathing steady. My eyes were closed, but my ears, my mind, were wide open, every sense straining to catch the words floating on the scent of oak and fermented grapes. What do you mean, the final stretch? Jessica asked. There was a pause. The clinking of glasses. Ethan must have been hesitating. The timing, he said finally, his voice a conspiratorial whisper now. The Thanksgiving dinner is just over a week before the 2-year mark. The 2-year mark of... Jessica let the question hang in the air. Of Dad's accident, Ethan said, the words clipped. It's the final audit period for the corporate insurance policy. Once that date passes and the original ruling of accidental death, no company negligence, stands, the final installment of the payout is released. My heart, that slow, steady drum, did not falter. This was it, the motivation, the why behind the cruelty, the gaslighting, the prison of my garage apartment. It was always about the money. I had known it, but I had not known the scale. Jessica's voice was sharp with avarice. The final installment. How much is it again exactly? You've been so vague. Ethan let out a low chuckle. It was a sound stripped of all warmth, a dry reptilian sound of pure, unadulterated greed. He must have felt completely safe, completely secure in his mother's senile presence. He said the number, and it landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. $4 million. $4 million. The number seemed to suck the air from the room. It was an obscene, astronomical figure. A fortune bought with my husband's life and my son's soul. 4. Jessica breathed the word. I could picture her eyes, wide and glittering. My God, Ethan. It was contingent, he went on, his voice filled with a sickening pride, the pride of a con man admiring his own scheme. The policy only pays out that full amount if the company is cleared of all negligence. It was a standard corporate liability clause. My report, the one I filed right after it happened, was the key. I detailed the safety protocols, a few new ones that I expedited. I made sure the official record showed that Dad's fall was a tragic, unforeseeable accident, that the company, and by extension his direct supervisor, me, had done everything by the book. The blood in my veins turned to ice. It wasn't just that he had let his father die. It wasn't just that he had covered it up. He had actively falsified records, crafting a narrative of lies on the foundation of his own father's death, all for a payday. The new safety procedures Frank had written to me about, the ones Robert had been so worried about, they weren't designed to protect the workers. They were designed to protect the company and unlock this blood money. And my son had been the architect of it all. So as long as no one challenges that report, Jessica said, her voice a low, hard whisper, as long as everything stays quiet until the 2-year mark passes. The money is transferred, Ethan finished, and we're set for life. That's why we've had to be so careful. Why we couldn't risk Mom. You know, making a scene or talking to the wrong people. Why we needed to keep her close. Keep things under control. 6 more months of this, Jessica had said that night I broke the glass. Now I understood. It wasn't 6 months from then. It was 6 more months from whenever that conversation had taken place, leading up to the 2-year anniversary of Robert's death. They needed to keep me silent and contained just long enough for the statute of limitations on whatever corporate claim might be made to expire. The threat of having me declared legally incompetent, the move to a nursing home, it was all part of the final stage of their plan. To neutralize me before the deadline, I didn't move a muscle. I let their words wash over me, cementing themselves into the map of their betrayal I held in my mind. The final coordinates were now in place. The $4 million prize, the falsified report, the deadline. Later that night, long after the clinking glasses had been washed and the house had fallen into a deep, ignorant slumber, I sat on the edge of my cot-like bed. The moon cast a pale, sterile light through the small window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. I held the 2 extra invitations in my hand, running my thumb over the names of Frank Peterson and Sarah Jenkins. They thought they were preparing for a dinner party, a celebration of their impending wealth and social triumph. They had no idea what they were truly preparing for. They were polishing silver for their own judgment day. They were selecting wine for their own execution. I was not a frail, confused old woman. I was a cartographer. And I had just finished drawing the most important map of my life. Every road, every pitfall, every hidden elevation was clear to me. And they were all leading to one place. The head of their perfectly set Thanksgiving table. I felt a profound, chilling calm settle over me. The grief was still there, a deep, permanent ache for Robert. But now, it was accompanied by something else. A cold, hard, and utterly lucid resolve. The performance was almost over. The truth was waiting in the wings. The heavy, cloying scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon-spiced pumpkin filled the house, a thick, sweet mask for the decay underneath. It was a smell I knew I would associate with the end of things for the rest of my days. I sat at the far end of the long, polished mahogany table, an afterthought in the seating arrangement, a ghost at the feast. From my vantage point, I was a cartographer observing a foreign landscape. The terrain was treacherous, filled with false smiles and glittering, sharp-edged conversations. Jessica, a vision in a wine-red dress, floated between guests, her laughter a perfectly pitched, tinkling sound that never quite reached her eyes. She was the gracious hostess, the perfect wife, the loving daughter-in-law. It was a masterful performance. Ethan, my son, was holding court at the center of the table, seated directly next to his boss, the imposing Mr. Davenport. He refilled the man's wineglass, leaning in to share a joke, his face a mask of earnest ambition. He looked so much like his father in that moment, but it was a cruel parody. Robert's features were there, but the light behind his eyes, the warmth, the integrity, all of it had been hollowed out, leaving only a polished shell. My granddaughter, Lily, sat across from me, picking at her food. She'd occasionally glance in my direction, her young face a mess of confusion and pity. Her parents had been so thorough in their campaign, painting me as a fragile, senile burden. She believed them, of course. How could she not? But in her eyes I saw a flicker of the girl I used to know, the one who would crawl into my lap with a picture book. That flicker was the only thing in this room that caused my heart to ache. The rest was just ice. The plates were eventually cleared away, leaving behind smears of gravy and crumbs of stuffing. The conversation ebbed, a comfortable wine-fueled lull settling over the room. This was the moment. I felt the familiar stillness I always did before beginning a complex map, the quiet intake of breath before the first line is drawn. Ethan pushed his chair back slightly and stood, raising his crystal glass. A hush fell. Light from the chandelier caught the rim of the glass, making it sparkle. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he began, his voice smooth and confident. He smiled, a broad, practiced smile that showcased his teeth. "I want to make a toast. On this day of thanks, I am overwhelmingly grateful for my family." He nodded toward Jessica, who beamed at him, then let his eyes sweep the room before they landed on me. The smile tightened, becoming something more solemn, more pained. "Family means everything," he continued, his voice taking on a graver tone. "It means making the hard choices, the selfless choices, for the people we love, even when it's painful." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle on the guests. They leaned in, their faces soft with sympathy. Mr. Davenport nodded slowly, a look of paternal approval on his face. "As some of you know," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on me, a surgeon discussing a difficult but necessary amputation. "My mother's health has been declining recently. Her memory, her grasp on things, it's not what it once was. We've been so worried." Jessica reached over and placed a hand on his arm, her expression a perfect portrait of wifely support. Her solitude, living out in the garage apartment, it's just not safe anymore. It's not fair to her. A sympathetic murmur rippled through the guests. "Oh, the poor dear. You're doing the right thing, Ethan. Such a good son." Each word was a small, sharp stone. Ethan let the murmurs die down before delivering the final, merciful blow. "So, after many sleepless nights and a lot of soul-searching, Jessica and I have made the difficult decision to move her into a wonderful assisted living facility starting next month." He raised his glass higher. "It's a beautiful place, the best we could find. She'll have round-the-clock care, activities, friends her own age. It's for her own good, for her safety and her happiness. So let's toast to family and to doing what's right no matter how hard it is." The clinking of glasses was a sound like shattering ice. They drank to my obsolescence, to my neatly packaged disposal. They drank to their own virtue. I watched them all, my face a carefully blank canvas. I let the pity wash over me, a cold tide. I felt Jessica's eyes on me, searching for tears, for a pathetic outburst. I gave her nothing. I simply took a slow sip of water, the cool liquid a balm to the fire in my chest. When the last toast was drunk and Ethan was accepting quiet words of praise from the guests around him, I placed my water glass down on the table with a soft, deliberate click. The sound was small, but in the self-congratulatory silence, it was enough. Every eye turned to me. I scraped my chair back, the noise loud against the hardwood floor, and slowly, with hands that did not tremble, I stood up. The room fell completely silent. The air crackled. This was my stage now. "That's very thoughtful of you, Ethan," I said. My voice didn't waver. It was not the thin, reedy voice of a confused old woman they had grown accustomed to. It was the voice of Chloe Vance, the cartographer. Clear, precise, and unwavering, it cut through the thick atmosphere of pity like a surveyor's laser. "Truly, a wonderful plan." Ethan's smile faltered. Jessica's hand froze on its way to her wine glass. They sensed the shift in the terrain, the sudden, unexpected change in the map. "But before I'm packed away for my own good," I continued, my eyes moving from my son's suddenly pale face to his boss, "I'd like to share a story. It seems appropriate for Thanksgiving. A story about your father, Ethan. A story about a man who believed in safety. A man who believed in marking the dangers on a map so that others wouldn't fall." I let my gaze settle fully on Mr. Davenport. He looked back at me, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild irritation at this disruption. He was a man used to being in charge, and the narrative had just been taken from his star employee. "My husband, Robert, was a meticulous man, Mr. Davenport. You may remember that about him. He didn't just see a construction site. He saw a complex system of forces, of risks and fail-safes. He drew maps, you see, not of land, but of procedure, of safety." I took a step away from the table, my body feeling lighter than it had in years. The shroud of helplessness was gone. "He was especially concerned about the new protocols your company was fast-tracking 2 years ago, the ones that saved so much time and money. He documented everything, because a good cartographer always accounts for hidden dangers." I paused, letting the room hang on my words. Frank, my husband's old colleague, sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on mine. He was my landmark, my true north in this room of enemies. "Which brings me to another subject," I said, my tone becoming even more measured, more conversational. "Insurance. A fascinating topic, really. It's all about calculating risk." I looked directly at Mr. Davenport, my head held high. "Did you know, sir, that the company's rather generous $4 million insurance policy for workplace fatalities, the one that covers your employees in the event of a tragic accident, has a very specific, very important clause. The color was draining from Ethan's face now. He looked like a man watching a chasm open up at his feet. And Jessica was frozen, her mouth slightly agape, the perfect hostess mask cracking to reveal the raw panic beneath. "The policy only pays out," I stated, my voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its steely clarity, "if an internal investigation yields a clear, unambiguous finding of no corporate negligence. A simple, clean, tragic accident. No faulty equipment, no rushed procedures, no cut corners." A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere down the table. The sound was like a gunshot. The sympathetic murmurs were gone, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable stillness. The guests were no longer looking at a poor, senile woman. They were looking at someone else entirely. They were looking at a map they didn't understand, and they were beginning to realize they were lost. The air was thick with the unsaid, with the sudden terrifying flash of understanding in my son's eyes. Panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. It was a fleeting thing, a flicker in his eyes before he masked it with indignation. "Mother, what are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice a half beat too loud. "You're confused. Please, sit down. You're upsetting our guests," Jessica chimed in, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to reclaim her role as the caretaker. "Chloe, darling, please, this isn't the time. You've had a long day. Let's not do this." Her plea was for herself, not for me. "I'm not confused, Jessica," I replied, my voice as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "In fact, I don't think I've been this clear in over 2 years. I am simply finishing my story." I turned my back on them, addressing Mr. Davenport once more. That finding of no negligence, the one required for the payout, must be signed off on by the head of on-site safety, the person responsible for implementing and overseeing the very protocols my husband was worried about. I let that hang in the air for a moment. My son, Ethan, as the new head of safety, provided that finding. He signed the report that cleared the company of all wrongdoing, paving the way for that $4 million settlement. Ethan started to speak again, a blustering denial forming on his lips, but I held up a hand. "But here," my voice was low, steady, a surgeon making the final incision. I reached down to the needlepoint bag at my feet, the one they all thought held nothing but knitting and old tissues. I pulled out a thick, worn manila folder. The edges were soft with age. On the front, in my husband's meticulous architectural script, were the words, "Winch System Integrity Reports." I slid it down the polished table. It glided silently, like a vessel on a dark, calm sea, coming to a stop directly in front of Mr. Davenport's plate. "Are the original safety reports my husband filed on 3 separate occasions in the month leading up to his death," I said softly. "They detail the systemic metal fatigue in the primary winch on the north crane, the one that failed. He begged in writing to have it replaced. You'll note the dates and the signatures of the foreman who received them." Mr. Davenport stared at the folder as if it were a coiled snake. He did not touch it. Ethan was white as a sheet. That's ridiculous. Those are fakes. Frank, that disgruntled old..." His voice trailed off as he saw the look on my face. "Oh, I have more," I said, my voice almost a whisper. I reached into my bag again and produced a second folder, this one newer, crisper. I didn't slide this one. I held it. My eyes found Sarah, the freelance journalist I had invited under the guise of being Lily's career mentor. Her phone, which had been resting by her plate, was now angled perfectly, its small red light glowing faintly. She met my gaze and gave a barely perceptible nod. "And here," I walked around the table and passed the second folder directly to her, "are the bank statements. They show the first installment of that insurance payout, a sum of $1 million, being wired from a holding company registered in Delaware, an affiliate of your primary insurer, Mr. Davenport, directly into a joint account belonging to Ethan and Jessica Vance. The transfer is dated 72 hours after my husband's death was officially ruled an accident with no corporate negligence. It was used, as you can see from the subsequent transaction, as the down payment on this very house. The house I was so generously invited to live in." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a soft, horrified sound. The lies had been stripped away, leaving the truth raw and bare and ugly for all to see. Then, Frank stood up. He was a big man, and his presence filled the silence. His face was etched with a grief I knew he had carried for 2 long years. "I can attest to the authenticity of those safety reports," he said, his voice deep and rumbling with conviction. He looked at Mr. Davenport, then at the stunned faces of the guests. "Robert gave me copies a week before he died. He put them in my hand. He looked me in the eye." Frank's voice broke for a second, but he steadied it, his resolve like iron. He looked at Ethan, a look of profound, soul-deep disappointment. He said to me, "Frank, if anything happens to me on that site, it wasn't an accident." The silence that followed my words was a fragile, crystalline thing. It held for a single, sharp intake of breath, the collective gasp of a room full of people who had come for turkey and polite conversation and were now witnesses to the detonation of a family. Then it shattered. The first sound was a low growl that seemed to vibrate from the very floorboards. It was Mr. Davenport. His face, which minutes before had been a portrait of genial, corporate authority, had transformed into a mask of pure, cold fury. The jovial flush was gone, replaced by a pale, tight-drawn canvas of rage. His eyes, fixed on Ethan, were like chips of ice. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was a low, dangerous weapon. $4 million, Ethan," he said, each word a perfectly enunciated drop of venom. "My company's name, my reputation. For a payout on a policy predicated on, what did your mother call it? No fault?" Jessica made a sound like a small wounded animal. She was on her feet, her hands fluttering at her throat as if trying to push air into lungs that had suddenly refused to work. "No," she gasped, her eyes darting around the room, desperately seeking an ally, an escape route, anything but the sea of horrified faces staring back at her. "No, this is a misunderstanding. Chloe, she's not well. We told you. She gets confused. She's grieving." But her words were hollow, pathetic lies against the weight of the truth I had laid on the table. No one was looking at her with pity. They were looking at her as if her skin had peeled back to reveal something monstrous beneath. Ethan, for his part, moved. It wasn't a thought-out action. It was pure, cornered animal instinct. He lunged across the corner of the table, his hand reaching not for me, but for the folder in Mr. Davenport's hand. The original safety reports, the truth in his father's own handwriting. He never made it. Frank, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, moved with a surprising speed for a man his age. He stepped forward and placed a firm, heavy hand on Ethan's chest, stopping him cold. Ethan stumbled back, his face a mess of panic and disbelief. "It's over, son," Frank said, and the words were not triumphant. They were impossibly heavy, weighted down with years of suspicion and a deep, profound disgust. The word son was not an endearment. It was an indictment. He was no longer Robert's boy. He was just a lesser, corrupted thing. The room itself began to dissolve. The carefully constructed illusion of a happy, successful family celebrating a holiday imploded. Guests were pushing their chairs back, the scrape of wood on the floor a screeching soundtrack to the chaos. They were backing away from the table, from Ethan and Jessica, their faces a mixture of shock and revulsion. I saw Mrs. Albright, a neighbor who always complimented Jessica's garden, clutch her husband's arm, her mouth a perfect O of horror. I saw Ethan's colleague from marketing, a man who had been laughing at his jokes an hour ago, staring at him as if he were a stranger. They were distancing themselves, creating a quarantine zone around the toxicity that had just been exposed. And then, another voice cut through the rising murmur. Clear, professional, and utterly detached. It was Sarah, the journalist. She was no longer Lily's career mentor. She was a predator who had just been served a feast. She had her phone to her ear, her back slightly turned to the mayhem, a pen already moving across a small notebook. "That's right, Mike," she said, her voice calm and clipped. "Davenport is the CEO. The company is Omnicorp Construction. The allegation is a multi-million-dollar insurance fraud scheme. Yes, connected to a workplace fatality 2 years ago. The son, Ethan Vance, is a senior manager. He allegedly falsified safety reports to assign blame to his own deceased father. I have copies of the documents. And a witness. No, it gets better. They used the initial payout to buy this house and were holding his elderly mother, the victim's widow, in a state of emotional and financial captivity. Get a photographer over here now. This isn't just a business story, Mike. This is everything. Breaking news. My secret pain, my quiet suffering, was no longer mine. It was being broadcast, packaged, and sent out into the world. I watched as Ethan's head snapped toward Sarah, the realization dawning on his face that this was no longer a family argument he could gaslight his way out of. This was a public execution. Jessica finally crumpled, sinking into her chair and letting out a dry, racking sob, her perfectly manicured hands covering her face. She wasn't crying for my husband, or for me, or for the family she had helped destroy. She was crying for the loss of her beautiful house, her social standing, her perfect life. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I had seen enough. The map was drawn, the destination reached. There was nothing more for the cartographer to do. Quietly, I pushed my own chair back. No one noticed. All eyes were on the spectacle at the head of the table, on the collapsing pillars of a house built on lies. I slipped out of the dining room, the sounds of Jessica's sobs and Mr. Davenport's cold, furious voice fading behind me. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps silent on the plush runner Jessica had been so proud of. I passed the living room, where the fire still crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, deceptive glow on the family photos arranged on the mantel. The photo of Ethan, Jessica, and Lily at the beach. The one with the caption, "Family is everything." My own prison, built with my own money. My room, the converted garage, felt different. It was no longer a cell. It was just a room. The faint scent of motor oil, and what Jessica called old people smell, was now the scent of a waiting room, a place of transition. I didn't have much. I had packed a small duffel bag a week ago, after the lawyer's letter had arrived. A few changes of clothes, Robert's old watch, a well-worn book of poetry. Everything I truly owned could fit in that single bag. I left behind the chipped plate, the threadbare towels, the single lumpy pillow. I left behind the ghost of my captivity. As I walked out the front door into the cool November night, the world felt sharp and new. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. And then I saw them, the flashing lights. A police car was pulling slowly up the long, curving driveway, its silent strobes painting the perfect facade of the house in frantic, alternating strokes of red and blue. The colors of emergency, the colors of consequence. A cry pierced the night. "Grandma!" I turned. Lily was running from the house, her party dress in disarray, tears streaming down her pale face, glittering in the pulsing lights. She threw herself into my arms, her small body trembling with sobs. She clung to me, her fingers digging into the fabric of my old coat. "Grandma," she wept into my shoulder. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know what they were doing." I held her tight, my hand stroking her hair. I felt the wetness of her tears soaking through to my skin. Of all the calculations, of all the risks, she was the one variable I had feared, the one piece of collateral damage that truly hurt. "I know, my sweet girl," I whispered, my voice thick. "I know you didn't." She pulled back, looking at me, her young face a canvas of confusion and grief. "What's going to happen? Where are you going?" I looked past her, at the house. My house. The house Robert and I were supposed to grow old in. It looked like a stage set now, unreal, painted in the garish lights of the law. I had my freedom. I had the truth. I had avenged my husband's memory. But to get it, I had been forced to take a surgical knife to my own life, cutting away my son, my home, my family. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of victory. There was only a vast, hollow quiet inside of me. It was the quiet peace of a map finally completed. The terrain had been charted, every treacherous path and hidden danger exposed. The work was done. But now, all I had was the map itself and an empty, unknown world ahead.